Henrik Larsson pressed his bare hand against the log wall in the corner of his cabin and felt ice crystals beneath his palm, even though the fireplace roared with split oak just 15 feet away. His 6-year-old daughter Ingrid had slept in that corner the night before, and this morning she couldn't stop shivering. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Henrik Larsson stood in the center of his cabin on a January morning in 1843, holding a candle near the corner where his daughter had slept. The flame bent toward the wall. Cold air was sinking there, pooling in the corner like water in a depression. He moved the candle to the opposite corner. The same phenomenon. Then to the back corners near the door. Identical behavior. The cold had claimed every corner of his home, and no amount of firewood could drive it out. The main fireplace dominated the cabin's west wall, built from clay bricks he had hauled from St. Paul the previous summer. It was a good fireplace by frontier standards. The firebox was deep enough to burn logs 3 feet long. The chimney drew smoke efficiently. When Henrik fed it properly, the flames reached 2 feet high, and the heat was intense enough to make him step back. But that heat rose straight up and out through the chimney, and what spread laterally into the room dissipated rapidly as it moved away from the source. The cabin measured 20 feet by 24 feet, larger than most settler homes in the Minnesota Territory. Henrik had built it during the summer of 1841, shortly after bringing his wife Karen and daughter Ingrid from Norway. The logs were white pine, each one stripped and notched with care. The roof was solid. The door fit snugly in its frame. By all measures, it was a well-constructed dwelling. Yet every winter morning, frost formed on the interior walls in the corners farthest from the fireplace. Henrik walked to the northeast corner and knelt down. A thin layer of ice had crystallized on the log surface overnight. The interior temperature in this spot was certainly below freezing, even though the cabin's center felt reasonably warm. He had placed Ingrid's sleeping pallet in this corner because it was away from the door and seemed sheltered. He had been wrong. Karen was preparing breakfast at the table near the fireplace, the only truly warm spot in the cabin. She glanced at Henrik and understood immediately what he was examining. They had discussed the cold corners dozens of times that winter. Other families had the same problem. It was accepted as an unavoidable aspect of frontier life. You built the largest fireplace you could afford, you burned as much wood as you could gather, and you accepted that parts of your home would be uninhabitable during deep winter. But Henrik could not accept it anymore. Not after this morning, not after finding Ingrid curled into a ball, her blankets pulled tight around her, her breath visible in the air, her lips faintly blue. The doctor in the settlement had examined her and declared it a mild chill, nothing serious yet. But he had warned Henrik explicitly. Children sleeping in freezing conditions developed lung ailments. Those ailments killed more children on the frontier than accidents or disease. If Ingrid spent another winter in that corner, she might not survive it. Henrik returned to the fireplace and sat on the bench he had built into the wall beside it. The heat felt wonderful on his face and hands. 3 feet away from the fire, the warmth was pleasant. 6 feet away it was barely noticeable. At the corners, it did not exist. Henrik Larsson had immigrated to the Minnesota Territory in the spring of 1841 with specific intentions. He was 32 years old, a carpenter by training, and he had saved money for 3 years working in Bergen before purchasing passage to America for himself, his wife, and their daughter. The land in Minnesota was available under terms that seemed impossible in Norway. A man could claim 160 acres, build a home, cultivate the soil, and own it outright after 5 years of continuous residence. Henrik had no interest in remaining a hired craftsman in Norway when he could become a landowner in America. The journey from New York to the Minnesota Territory had taken 6 weeks. They traveled by riverboat up the Hudson, across the Erie Canal, through the Great Lakes, and finally up the Mississippi to Fort Snelling. From there they joined a small group of Norwegian families settling near the confluence of two creeks about 30 miles northwest of the fort. The land was heavily forested, which meant abundant building materials but difficult clearing. Henrik selected a parcel on a slight elevation with good drainage and a spring-fed stream within 200 yards. He spent the summer of 1841 building the cabin. The work was straightforward for a man with carpentry skills. He felled white pines, stripped them, notched the ends, and stacked them into walls. He split planks for the door and shutters. He gathered clay and formed bricks for the fireplace, baking them in a temporary kiln. By September, the cabin was complete, and the family moved from their tent into solid shelter. The first winter had been difficult but survivable. Henrik had cut and stacked 8 cords of firewood, which proved barely adequate. The cabin stayed tolerably warm near the fireplace, but the corners were cold. Karin hung blankets from the ceiling to create a smaller space around the fire, reducing the volume they needed to heat. They slept close to the hearth and ventured into the cold sections of the cabin only when necessary. Ingrid, who was 5 years old that winter, seemed to tolerate the conditions without complaint. The summer of 1842 brought expansion. Henrik cleared 3 acres and planted wheat and potatoes. He built a small barn for the cow and chickens they had acquired from another settler. He added shelving inside the cabin and improved the door's fit. He felt confident about the coming winter because he had cut 12 cords of firewood, 50% more than the previous year. More wood meant more heat, which meant a warmer cabin. But the winter of 1842 proved colder than the previous year. Snow fell in early November and did not melt until late March. Temperatures dropped low enough to freeze water in a bucket within an hour of bringing it inside. Henrik burned wood constantly, going through his stockpile far faster than anticipated. Despite the enormous fire he maintained, the corners of the cabin remained freezing. The blanket partitions helped create a warm core near the fireplace, but the overall living space was reduced to perhaps 1/3 of the cabin's total area. Ingrid's sleeping corner was the coldest spot. Karin had placed extra blankets there and positioned the pallet away from the walls, but the temperature in that section regularly dropped below freezing overnight. In early January, Ingrid developed a persistent cough. Within days, she was feverish and weak. The doctor from the settlement made the journey to examine her and diagnosed a respiratory infection likely caused by prolonged cold exposure. He provided willow bark tea for the fever and instructed that Ingrid must sleep in a warm location. Henrik moved Ingrid's pallet next to the fireplace, displacing the space where he and Karin had been sleeping. The 3 of them now crowded into an area roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, the only section of the cabin that maintained temperatures above freezing at night. Ingrid recovered slowly over the following 2 weeks, but the experience shook Henrik deeply. Henrik spent the following weeks observing the behavior of heat inside his cabin with an intensity that concerned his wife. He held candles in different locations and watched how the flames moved. He placed his hand at various heights and distances from the fireplace, noting where warmth could be felt and where it disappeared entirely. He burned different types of wood at different rates and measured how far the heat penetrated into the room. What he discovered was a fundamental problem with single fireplace cabin design that no amount of firewood could overcome. The physics were simple once he understood them. Heat rose. The hottest air in the cabin was not at ground level where people lived, but near the ceiling, directly above the fire. That superheated air flowed upward into the chimney and exited the cabin entirely, carrying with it the majority of the energy produced by burning wood. Some heat radiated outward from the firebox itself, warming the air in front of the fireplace, but this warmth had to travel horizontally across the entire cabin to reach the far corners. As it traveled, it cooled. By the time it reached the walls 20 feet away, it had lost most of its energy. Meanwhile, cold air was entering the cabin through inevitable gaps around the door, between logs, and through the shuttered window. This cold air was denser than warm air, so it sank to the floor and flowed along the ground toward the fireplace, where it was heated and rose again. The result was a circulation pattern that pulled cold air across the floor toward the fire while pushing hot air up and out through the chimney. The corners of the cabin were dead zones where cold air pooled and warm air never reached. Henrik discussed his observations with other settlers. Every family reported the same problem. Cabins were warm near the fireplace and cold everywhere else. The standard solutions were to build larger fireplaces, burn more wood, or partition the cabin to create smaller heated spaces. But larger fireplaces sent even more heat straight up the chimney. Burning more wood was expensive in terms of labor and depleted the forest faster. Partitioning the cabin meant abandoning much of the living space during winter. One neighbor suggested building a second fireplace on the opposite wall. Henrik considered this seriously. 2 fireplaces would create 2 warm zones, reducing the distance cold corners sat from a heat source. But 2 fireplaces meant 2 chimneys, which doubled the construction effort and material cost. More significantly, 2 separate fireplaces would still send most of their heat straight up and out. The circulation pattern would improve, but the fundamental inefficiency would remain. Henrik began sketching designs in a journal he kept for carpentry notes. He drew the cabin from above, marking the fireplace location and using arrows to show how he believed air moved through the space. He drew heat radiating outward from the fireplace in concentric circles, fading as distance increased. He marked the cold corners in dark ink. Then he started experimenting with alternative configurations. What if the fireplace was in the center of the cabin instead of against a wall? The heat would radiate in all directions equally, reducing the maximum distance to any corner. But a central fireplace was complicated to build and would dominate the living space. What if there were multiple small fires instead of one large one? Heat sources distributed around the room would eliminate cold zones, but managing several fires simultaneously seemed impractical. Then Henrik had a different idea. What if one chimney could serve multiple fireboxes? A single large chimney stack could handle the smoke from several small fires if the flues were designed correctly. Multiple small fires positioned strategically around the cabin would create overlapping heat zones, eliminating cold corners entirely. The total amount of wood burned would be the same, but the heat distribution would be far more efficient. He sketched a cabin with 3 small fireplaces, one on the west wall where the current fireplace stood, one in the northeast corner where Ingrid had been sleeping, and one in the southeast corner near the door. Each fireplace would be smaller than a standard design, perhaps 1/3 the size. All 3 would connect to a single large chimney stack rising through the center of the cabin. The engineering would be complex, but Henrik believed it was possible. On the morning of February 9, 1843, Henrik woke to find Ingrid shivering violently, despite sleeping directly beside the fireplace. The fire had burned down during the night, and although coals remained, the heat output had dropped significantly. Karen was already awake, adding wood and stoking the flames. The interior of the cabin was brutally cold. Frost covered the windows, and the walls showed white crystalline patterns where moisture had frozen overnight. Ingrid's lips had a faint blue tint. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. When Karen touched her forehead, the child's skin felt cold rather than feverish, which was more alarming. They wrapped her in every blanket they owned and held her close to the rebuilt fire. Within 20 minutes, color returned to her face, and the shivering subsided. But the incident terrified Henrik in a way the previous illness had not. He had failed at the most basic requirement of frontier survival. He had built a cabin that could not protect his daughter from the cold. All his carpentry skill, all the carefully notched logs, all the hours spent sealing gaps and improving the structure meant nothing if the interior temperature dropped to lethal levels while his family slept. The fireplace that seemed so substantial and well-built was fundamentally inadequate. After breakfast, with Ingrid recovered and playing quietly near the fire, Henrik told Karin about his idea for 3 fireplaces, connected to one chimney. He showed her the sketches in his journal, explaining how multiple heat sources would eliminate cold zones and create a circulation pattern that warmed the entire cabin uniformly. Karin listened carefully. She understood immediately that he was proposing something unprecedented and difficult. Her first question was practical. How much would it cost? Henrik had calculated the materials needed. The existing fireplace could be partially salvaged, but he would need approximately 800 additional bricks, 3 separate iron dampers, 3 grates, and considerable quantities of clay mortar. The bricks alone would cost $8 if purchased in St. Paul. The ironwork would cost another $6. The total expense would be roughly $15, which represented 2 months of income from selling timber and produce. Her second question was more pointed. Would it work? Henrik admitted he did not know with certainty. He believed the physics were sound, but he had never seen a design like this implemented. He was proposing to demolish their only source of heat and rebuild it based on a theory he had developed by watching candle flames and sketching air movement patterns. If he was wrong, they would have wasted money and time and potentially destroyed a functional fireplace in the process. Karin looked at Ingrid, who was wrapped in blankets despite sitting 3 feet from a roaring fire. Then she looked at the frost on the walls. She told Henrik to proceed. They would find the money, they would accept the risk. Anything was better than another winter like this one. Henrik spent the rest of February refining his design. He needed to solve several technical problems. First, how would 3 separate flues enter a single chimney stack without interfering with each other? Second, how would he control the draft in each flue independently to prevent one fire from stealing air from the others? Third, how would he support the weight of a chimney stack large enough to handle 3 flues? He visited the settlement's blacksmith and discussed requirements for the iron dampers. Standard dampers were simple plates that could be rotated to close off a flue. Henrik needed dampers that could be adjusted to partially restrict airflow, allowing precise control of each fire's intensity. The blacksmith sketched a design using a hinged plate with notches for fixed positions. He could forge 3 units for $5 total, less than Henrik had estimated. Henrik purchased clay from a settler who had a good deposit on his property. He paid $1 for enough clay to make approximately 1,000 bricks. He spent 3 weeks in March forming bricks and baking them in his kiln. The process was tedious but familiar. Each brick had to be shaped by hand, dried for several days, then baked at high temperature for 8 hours. By early April, he had 923 usable bricks stacked beside his cabin, enough for the chimney and 3 fireplaces with a small margin for error. Henrik began his systematic study of heat distribution on February 15th, the day after Karin approved his plan. He understood that before he could build a better system, he needed to comprehend exactly how the current system failed. He approached this with the methodical mindset of a craftsman solving a technical problem, measuring and documenting everything he observed. He started by mapping temperature zones. Using a simple thermometer he had purchased in St. Paul the previous year, he measured air temperature at various locations throughout the cabin at different times of day. He took measurements at floor level, waist height, and near the ceiling. He recorded data when the fire was freshly stoked, when it had burned for several hours, and when it was reduced to coals. The patterns were consistent and revealing. Directly in front of the fireplace at waist height, temperatures reached 70 degrees when the fire was strong. 3 feet away, the temperature dropped to 60 degrees. 6 feet away, it was 55 degrees. At the far wall 20 feet from the fire, the temperature was 42 degrees with the fire burning vigorously. In the corners, temperatures dropped as low as 38 degrees. These measurements were taken during afternoon hours when the fire had been maintained all day. Overnight, when the fire burned lower, corner temperatures regularly dropped below freezing. Henrik then studied air movement using smoke from a candle. He walked slowly through the cabin holding the smoking candle at different heights and watching which direction the smoke drifted. Near the fireplace, smoke was pulled strongly toward the firebox and up the chimney, indicating rapid air movement. In the center of the room, smoke rose slowly and drifted toward the fireplace at a walking pace. In the corners, smoke hung nearly motionless or actually sank toward the floor, indicating cold, stagnant air with no circulation. He placed candles in all four corners one evening and watched them for an hour. The flames in the corners nearest the fireplace flickered slightly, bending toward the center of the room as air moved slowly toward the heat source. The flames in the far corners barely moved at all. They burned straight up in still air. No convection current reached those locations. The air there was isolated from the cabin's circulation pattern entirely. Henrik noticed something else during his observations. When he opened the door, cold air rushed in along the floor and flowed directly toward the fireplace like water running downhill. He could feel it moving past his legs in a steady stream. Meanwhile, warm air from the cabin flowed outward through the top half of the doorway. The cabin was not a closed system. It was constantly exchanging air with the outside, with cold air entering low and warm air exiting high. The fireplace accelerated this exchange by creating a powerful updraft that pulled air through the cabin and expelled it through the chimney. This insight was critical. The fireplace was not just heating air inefficiently, it was actively pumping warm air out of the cabin and drawing cold air in to replace it. The stronger the fire, the faster this air exchange occurred. Henrik was burning enormous quantities of wood to heat air that immediately left through the chimney, while continuously drawing in freezing air that had to be heated from scratch. The system was fundamentally wasteful. Henrik calculated that his fireplace probably sent 70% of its heat directly up the chimney without ever warming the living space. Of the 30% that radiated into the room, perhaps half reached the far corners with enough intensity to matter. This meant he was capturing only 15% of the potential heat energy in the wood he burned. The other 85% was wasted. He shared these findings with two neighboring settlers who stopped by in late February. Both men were interested in Henrik's measurements and confirmed that their cabins behaved identically. One neighbor suggested that the solution was simply to burn more wood. If the system was only 15% efficient, burn 7 times more wood to compensate. Henrik pointed out that this would require cutting and hauling approximately 60 cords of firewood per winter instead of 10, an impossible amount of labor. The other neighbor suggested improving insulation, pack more moss between the logs, seal every gap, reduce air infiltration. Henrik agreed this would help, but argued it did not address the core problem. Even a perfectly sealed cabin would still send most of its heat up the chimney while leaving corners cold. The issue was not air leakage, but heat distribution. Both neighbors eventually acknowledged that Henrik was correct. The single fireplace design was inherently flawed, but neither man could envision an alternative. Fireplaces had been built this way for centuries. If there was a better method, surely someone would have discovered it already. Henrik explained his 3-fireplace concept. Both men were skeptical. One said it sounded complicated and expensive. The other said it would probably fill the cabin with smoke. Neither offered encouragement. Henrik spent the first week of March developing detailed plans for his 3-fireplace system. He worked in the evenings after completing daily chores, sitting at the table near the fire with his journal open, sketching and calculating. Karin watched him fill page after page with drawings, measurements, and notes. She understood that he was attempting something no one in the territory had tried before, and the weight of that innovation pressed on both of them. The fundamental design challenge was the chimney stack. A standard chimney was built to handle one flue, a vertical channel approximately 8 inches by 12 inches that carried smoke from a single firebox. Henrik needed a chimney that could handle 3 flues simultaneously without allowing smoke from one fire to interfere with the others. His solution was to build a chimney stack with 3 separate channels, each isolated from the others, but all enclosed within the same exterior brick structure. He sketched the chimney in cross-section. The base would be 2 feet square, larger than any cabin chimney in the settlement. Inside this square structure, 3 rectangular flues would rise vertically, separated by brick walls 4 inches thick. Each flue would be 8 inches wide and 10 inches deep, adequate for a small fireplace. The 3 flues would remain separate until they reached the roofline, where they would exit through a common stack capped with a single cover to keep out rain and snow. The mathematics of weight concerned him significantly. A standard chimney using approximately 250 bricks weighed roughly 1,200 pounds. Henrik's chimney would use over 600 bricks and weigh approximately 3,000 pounds. This mass had to be supported by the cabin's foundation and floor structure, neither of which had been designed for such a load. He would need to reinforce the foundation beneath the chimney location with additional stone and create a dedicated support structure. The fireplace locations were dictated by geometry and practicality. The primary fireplace would remain on the west wall where the current fireplace stood. This position was convenient for the door and allowed the chimney stack to rise through the center of the cabin's floor plan. The second fireplace would be built in the northeast corner, the coldest spot in the cabin where Ingrid had been sleeping. The third would be in the southeast corner near the door, where cold air entered most aggressively. Each fireplace would be approximately 1/3 the size of a standard design. The firebox would be 18 inches wide, 16 inches deep, and 20 inches high. These dimensions were large enough to burn split logs, but small enough to maintain a fire efficiently with modest fuel. Henrik calculated that burning 3 small fires would consume roughly the same amount of wood as 1 large fire, but would distribute heat far more effectively throughout the space. The flue connections presented a technical puzzle. Each fireplace would need a flue that traveled from its location to the central chimney stack. The west wall fireplace could connect directly, since the chimney would rise immediately behind it. But the northeast and southeast fireplaces were in corners, 10 to 12 feet from the central chimney. Their flues would need to travel horizontally before connecting to the vertical stack. Henrik designed angled flue channels that would rise at approximately 30 degrees from each corner fireplace toward the central chimney. These channels would be enclosed in brick, creating visible diagonal structures running from the corners to the chimney like flying buttresses. The design was unusual, but it solved the connection problem. Each flue would maintain adequate draft because the horizontal distance was short, and the upward angle was steep enough to prevent smoke from settling. The damper system was essential for controlling each fire independently. If all 3 fires drew air through the same chimney without individual controls, the largest fire would dominate the draft and starve the others. Henrik needed dampers that could restrict airflow precisely, allowing him to balance the 3 fires so they burned at similar rates. The blacksmith's design with notched positions would work perfectly. Each damper could be set to fully open, 3/4 open, half open, or 1/4 open, providing adequate control. Material calculations were straightforward but sobering. 630 bricks for the chimney and 3 small fireplaces, 3 iron dampers at $1.70 each, 3 iron grates at $1 each, 40 pounds of iron chain for the damper mechanisms at 12 cents per pound, clay mortar requiring approximately 200 pounds of clay mixed with sand and water. The total cost would be $16.30, slightly more than his original estimate. Henrik presented the completed plans to Karen on March 7th. He showed her every sketch, explained every calculation, and walked her through the construction sequence. She studied the drawings carefully and asked practical questions. Where would they cook during construction? How long would the cabin be uninhabitable? What would they do if the design failed? News of Henrik's plan spread through the settlement within days. In a community of fewer than 40 families scattered across several square miles, any unusual activity became common knowledge quickly. By mid-March, 3 neighbors had visited specifically to examine Henrik's sketches and hear his explanation of the 3-fireplace system. Their reactions ranged from puzzlement to open ridicule. The first visitor was Thomas McCarty, an Irish immigrant who had settled 2 miles south of Henrik's claim. McCarty studied the drawings for several minutes before declaring the entire concept wasteful. Why build 3 small fireplaces when one large one would produce more heat? Henrik explained the distribution problem, but McCarty was unconvinced. A proper fire should be large and hot. Splitting it into 3 weak fires made no sense. He left shaking his head. The second visitor was Johann Schmidt, a German carpenter whose opinion Henrik valued. Schmidt examined the chimney design with professional interest and immediately identified the weight problem. 3,000 pounds concentrated in the center of the cabin would stress the floor joists and foundation. Henrik showed him the reinforcement plans, but Schmidt remained skeptical. He also questioned the angled flues connecting the corner fireplaces to the central stack. Horizontal flue runs created draft problems, and smoke could back up into the room. Schmidt suggested Henrik was attempting something unnecessarily complicated when proven designs existed. The third visitor was Lars Olsen, a fellow Norwegian who had immigrated 5 years earlier and was considered successful by settlement standards. Olsen was blunt. The design was madness. Henrik would spend weeks tearing apart a functional fireplace and months building an experimental system that probably would not work. During that time, the family would have no heat source. If the design failed, Henrik would have to rebuild the original fireplace, wasting an entire summer. The risk was absurd when simple solutions existed, like building a second cabin room with its own fireplace. Word spread further. At the settlement store where Henrik purchased supplies, the clerk mentioned that people were talking about Larsen's triple chimney folly. 2 men at the blacksmith shop made jokes about Henrik trying to heat his cabin with 3 candles instead of 1 fire. A woman at the Sunday gathering asked Karin if her husband had struck his head recently because the plan sounded like the thinking of an injured man. The mockery stung, but Henrik pressed forward. He had lived through 2 winters watching his daughter suffer in frozen corners. He had measured the temperatures and understood the physics. The current system was fundamentally flawed, and no one else was proposing solutions. If the settlement thought him mad, he would accept that judgment and build anyway. Henrik began gathering materials in late March as soon as the weather permitted extended outdoor work. The ground was still partially frozen, but daytime temperatures rose above freezing consistently. He needed to accumulate everything required for construction before demolishing the existing fireplace, because once that demolition began, the family would have no heat source until the new system was complete. The bricks he had made in March were stacked and covered with canvas to keep them dry. He inspected each one carefully and culled approximately 30 that showed cracks or poor firing. The remaining 890 provided adequate quantity with margin for breakage during construction. He organized them by size and quality, separating the best bricks for the visible exterior work and reserving irregular pieces for interior courses where appearance did not matter. The iron hardware arrived from the blacksmith in early April. The 3 dampers were beautifully crafted, each one featuring a hinged plate that could be positioned at 4 fixed angles using a chain mechanism. Henrik tested each damper mechanism repeatedly, confirming smooth operation and secure locking at each position. The grates were simple but sturdy, designed to support burning logs while allowing ash to fall through. Clay for mortar was the next priority. Henrik needed approximately 300 pounds of workable clay mixed with sand in a ratio of 3 parts clay to 1 part sand. He had purchased clay in March, but it had dried into hard chunks during storage. He broke the chunks into smaller pieces using a hammer and soaked them in water for 2 days until they returned to a pliable state. He mixed in sand from the creek bed, kneading the mixture thoroughly until it achieved consistent texture. Stone for the reinforced foundation required several days of work. Henrik needed flat stones large enough to provide stable support, but small enough to transport. He searched along the creek and found a location where erosion had exposed a layer of limestone. Using a pry bar and sledge, he split pieces weighing 30 to 60 pounds each. He hauled them to the cabin using a wooden sled, making repeated trips over 4 days until he had accumulated sufficient quantity. The reinforcement structure would consist of stones laid in a bed beneath the cabin floor where the chimney would rise. Henrik calculated he needed a foundation pad approximately 3 feet square and 8 inches thick. This required roughly 120 stones arranged in overlapping courses and mortared together. The weight of the stones alone would be approximately 1,500 pounds, doubling the total support mass beneath the chimney. On May 5, 1843, Henrik began dismantling the fireplace that had served his family for 2 winters. The decision to start demolition represented a point of no return. Once the fireplace was gone, the family would have no heat source except a small outdoor fire pit. If construction took longer than expected or the design failed, they would face serious hardship. Karin and Ingrid moved essential items into the small barn. They would sleep there during construction, using blankets and the residual warmth from the cow and chickens. Cooking would be done outside over an open fire. The cabin would become a construction site, uninhabitable, until the new system was complete. Henrik started by removing the existing chimney. Working from the roof downward, he carefully knocked out mortar joints and separated bricks. The work was tedious and physically demanding. Each brick had to be cleaned of old mortar before it could be reused. He salvaged 238 bricks in usable condition and stacked them for incorporation into the new chimney. The firebox came next. Henrik demolished it completely, breaking apart the clay brick structure and removing debris. He pulled out the old grate and damper mechanism, both too damaged for reuse. Within 3 days, the entire fireplace was gone, leaving only a dark, rectangular scar on the west wall where it had stood. The cabin felt hollow without the fireplace. The space seemed larger, but also vulnerable. Henrik experienced a moment of doubt standing in the empty room. He had destroyed the only proven heat source based on sketches and theories. If he failed, his family would suffer through next winter in impossible conditions. He pushed the doubt aside and began preparing the foundation for the central chimney stack. The central chimney stack presented engineering problems Henrik had never encountered in standard construction. A typical chimney rose straight up from a single fireplace, its weight distributed across a relatively small area. Henrik's chimney needed to rise from the cabin's center while accepting 3 separate flues, entering from different directions. The structural demands were unprecedented in his experience. He began by excavating beneath the cabin floor where the chimney would stand. Using a shovel and pry bar, he removed dirt to a depth of 12 inches, creating a pit 3 feet square. He leveled the bottom carefully and began laying the stone foundation. Each stone was set in clay mortar and positioned to interlock with adjacent stones. The first course formed a solid base. Subsequent courses were laid with joints offset, creating a stable structure that distributed weight evenly. The foundation rose 8 inches above the cabin floor level, creating a platform for the chimney base. Henrik built the first courses of the chimney itself, using his best bricks, laying them in a 2-foot square pattern with thick mortar joints. The exterior walls were 8 inches thick, composed of 2 layers of bricks. Inside this square, He began forming the 3 separate flues. The flue channels had to be precisely positioned. The west flue connected directly to where the primary fireplace would be rebuilt. The northeast and southeast flues needed openings that would receive the angled flue channels from the corner fireplaces. Henrik used wooden templates to maintain correct dimensions as he built upward. Each flue measured 8 inches by 10 inches internally, surrounded by 4 inches of brick on all sides. The technical challenge intensified as the chimney rose. Henrik had to maintain 3 separate channels while ensuring the exterior structure remained stable and square. He checked vertical alignment constantly using a plumb line. Any deviation would compound as the chimney rose higher, potentially creating draft problems or structural weakness. Henrik worked on the chimney and fireplace system for 8 consecutive weeks, starting in early May and continuing through late June. The construction consumed every daylight hour. He rose at dawn and worked until darkness made accurate bricklaying impossible. Karin assisted when she could, mixing mortar and handing bricks while managing Ingrid and maintaining the household from their temporary shelter in the barn. The central chimney stack rose slowly, 1 course at a time. By mid-May, it had reached 6 feet in height and extended through the roof. Henrik built a temporary scaffold around it to work safely at elevation. The 3 flues remained separate and parallel as they rose, each channel maintaining its 8 by 10 inch dimensions. He tested the draft in each flue regularly by burning paper at the base and watching smoke rise. All 3 drew adequately. The primary fireplace on the west wall was rebuilt first. Henrik constructed the firebox using salvaged bricks from the original fireplace, creating a chamber 18 inches wide, 16 inches deep, and 20 inches tall. He installed the first damper mechanism in the flue just above the firebox, positioning it so the chain control hung within easy reach. The grate fit perfectly, supported on brick ledges built into the firebox sides. The corner fireplaces presented greater difficulty. Henrik had to build the fireboxes in the northeast and southeast corners, then construct angled flue channels that rose from each firebox toward the central chimney stack. These angled channels were essentially brick tunnels traveling diagonally upward through the cabin's interior space. He built them carefully, maintaining the 30-degree angle and ensuring smooth interior surfaces to promote good draft. The northeast corner fireplace was completed by early June. Its flue rose from the corner, angled across 10 feet of space, and connected to the northeast channel of the central chimney at a height of 4 feet above the floor. The connection required precise cutting and fitting of bricks to merge the angled flue smoothly into the vertical channel. Henrik tested it by burning wood scraps in the firebox. Smoke rose cleanly through the angled flue and up the chimney without backing into the room. The completed system represented a significant departure from conventional fireplace design, both structurally and functionally. 3 independent fireplaces fed into a single chimney stack, each with its own damper control, each positioned to address specific cold zones within the cabin. The innovation was not merely adding more fireplaces, but creating a coordinated heating system where multiple small fires worked together to warm the entire space uniformly. The strategic placement of the 3 fireplaces created overlapping heat zones. The primary fireplace on the west wall warmed the cabin's central and western areas. The northeast corner fireplace addressed the coldest zone where Ingrid had slept. The southeast corner fireplace countered cold air entering through the door. Together, the 3 fires eliminated the dead zones that plagued single fireplace designs. The physics of the system relied on convection currents. Each small fire created a rising column of warm air. This warm air spread outward as it rose, creating a circulation pattern. With 3 fires operating simultaneously, 3 separate circulation patterns overlapped and reinforced each other. Warm air from one fire mixed with warm air from the others, maintaining elevated temperatures throughout the cabin rather than just in isolated zones near each fireplace. The damper controls allowed Henrik to balance the three fires precisely. If one area of the cabin felt cooler, he could open that fireplace's damper slightly to increase its draft and intensify the fire. If another area became too warm, he could partially close its damper to reduce the fire's intensity. This level of control was impossible with a single large fireplace, where the fire was either burning strongly or dying down with no intermediate adjustments. The angled flue channels created a distinctive interior appearance. Two brick structures rose from the floor corners at 30-degree angles, traveling across the room toward the central chimney like diagonal supports. Henrik had painted them white using lime wash, making them architectural features rather than obtrusive additions. The visual effect was unusual but not unpleasant. The structures also radiated heat as smoke passed through them, functioning as secondary heat sources. Henrik completed the construction on June 28, 1843. The family moved back into the cabin the following day, though they would not need heating for several months. The three fireplaces stood ready, each with its stack of prepared kindling and split wood. The damper chains hung from their mechanisms, waiting to be adjusted. The central chimney rose through the roof, its triple flues capped with a custom cover Henrik had fashioned from sheet metal. The system was complete, but entirely untested under actual winter conditions. Summer provided an opportunity for careful experimentation without the pressure of freezing temperatures. Henrik began testing in early July, burning small fires in various combinations to understand how the system behaved. He started with the primary west wall fireplace alone, burning a modest fire and observing smoke flow and heat distribution. The fire drew well, smoke rose cleanly through the flue, and the damper control worked smoothly. Heat radiated from the firebox as expected, warming the central portion of the cabin. He then tested the northeast corner fireplace. This one concerned him most because of its angled flue connection. If the design had a fundamental flaw, it would likely appear here. He built a small fire and watched carefully. Initially, smoke hesitated at the firebox opening, swirling uncertainly. Henrik opened the damper fully and waited. Within 2 minutes, draft established itself. Smoke began flowing up the angled channel steadily. He fed the fire additional wood, and it burned cleanly with no smoke entering the room. The angled flue worked. The southeast corner fireplace tested successfully as well. Its angled flue was shorter than the northeast connection, and draft established more quickly. Henrik burned fires in all three fireplaces simultaneously for the first time on July 15th. Managing three fires required attention and coordination. Each needed to be started separately, built up gradually, and maintained at appropriate levels. The wood consumption was significant, but the heat output was remarkable, even in summer weather. Over the following weeks, Henrik refined his technique. He learned that the three fires needed to be balanced carefully. If one fire burned significantly hotter than the others, it dominated the chimney draft and weakened the draw on the remaining two. The solution was to adjust dampers, so all three fires received adequate air and burned at similar intensities. He developed a rhythm of checking each fire every 20 minutes, adding wood as needed, and adjusting dampers to maintain balance. He also discovered that the corner fireplaces required different wood than the primary fireplace. Large logs worked well in the west wall firebox, but the corner fireplaces performed better with smaller split pieces that burned quickly and produced consistent heat. He began preparing two types of firewood, larger pieces for the main fireplace and smaller splits for the corners. This added labor to wood processing, but improved system performance significantly. By late August, Henrik felt confident in his ability to manage the system. He had burned fires dozens of times, experimented with different wood types and fire sizes, and learned the subtle adjustments that kept all three fires burning efficiently. The system demanded more attention than a single fireplace, but the heat distribution was dramatically superior. Even during summer testing, When ambient temperatures made heating unnecessary, he could feel the difference in how warmth spread throughout the cabin. He made final adjustments in September as temperatures began dropping at night. He sealed small gaps around the angled flue channels where they met the central chimney. He improved the damper mechanisms by adding friction washers that held them more securely in position. He built small wooden doors for each firebox that could be closed when fires were not burning, preventing drafts from flowing through the cold flues. These refinements were minor but important, preparing the system for the demanding test that winter would bring. The true validation would come when temperatures dropped below zero, and his family's comfort and safety depended entirely on whether 3 small fires could warm a cabin better than 1 large fire ever had. Henrik had built something unprecedented based on observation, calculation, and theory. Now winter would prove whether innovation could triumph over tradition. The winter of 1843 to 1844 arrived early. Snow fell in late October, and by early November, temperatures were dropping below freezing at night. Henrik began burning fires in the evening to test the system under real conditions. The results exceeded his expectations immediately. With all 3 fireplaces operating, the cabin warmed uniformly from corner to corner. The temperature difference between the area near the fires and the farthest corners was less than 5 degrees, a dramatic improvement over the 20 to 30 degree variation they had experienced previous winters. Karen noticed the difference most acutely in the morning. Previously, she had woken to find frost on the interior walls and her breath visible in the air despite the fireplace burning all night. Now, even when the fires burned down to coals overnight, the cabin retained warmth. The thermal mass of 3 brick fireplaces and the extensive chimney structure absorbed heat during the evening and radiated it slowly through the night. The cabin temperature never dropped below 50 degrees, even on the coldest nights. Ingrid's sleeping corner, the spot that had been lethally cold the previous winter, was now one of the warmest locations in the cabin. The northeast corner fireplace kept that entire section comfortable. Ingrid's pallet was positioned 5 feet from the firebox, close enough to benefit from direct radiant heat, but far enough to avoid danger. She slept comfortably under a single blanket, rather than the multiple layers she had required previously. Wood consumption initially concerned Henrik. 3 fires obviously required more wood than 1 fire. But as he gained experience managing the system, he realized the total consumption was only marginally higher than his previous single fireplace usage. The key was burning smaller fires that could be controlled precisely. 3 modest fires distributed strategically consumed roughly the same wood as 1 large fire, while providing far better heat distribution. He estimated he was burning perhaps 15% more wood, but achieving at least 300% improvement in heating effectiveness. The system's efficiency became most apparent during the coldest periods. In January, temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero for a week. During previous winters, such cold would have made the cabin barely habitable despite burning enormous quantities of wood. This winter, Henrik maintained comfortable interior temperatures throughout the cold snap. He burned fires constantly, checking and adjusting them every few hours, adding wood as needed, and fine-tuning dampers to keep all 3 fires balanced. The work was demanding, but the result was a cabin that remained warm in every corner. Henrik began keeping detailed records in mid-January. He measured interior temperature at 6 locations throughout the cabin at 6-hour intervals. The data confirmed what he felt experientially. The cabin maintained remarkably uniform temperature. The warmest spot, directly in front of the west wall fireplace, averaged 68 degrees when fires were burning actively. The coolest spot near the door averaged 62 degrees, 6 degrees of variation across the entire space, compared to the 30-plus degree variations he had measured the previous winter. He also documented wood consumption carefully. Between November 1st and March 1st, he burned 11 1/2 cords of wood, maintaining the three-fireplace system. The previous winter, burning a single large fireplace, he had consumed 12 cords and achieved inferior heating. The efficiency gain was measurable and significant. He was burning less wood to heat the cabin more effectively, exactly the outcome his design had intended. Visitors began arriving in February. Word had spread that Henrik's experimental heating system was actually functioning. Thomas McCarty, who had dismissed the plan as wasteful, came to see for himself. He spent an hour in the cabin, moving from corner to corner, feeling the consistent warmth everywhere. He examined the three fireplaces, studied the angled flue channels, and inspected the central chimney. He admitted he had been wrong. The system worked better than he had imagined possible. Johann Schmidt arrived a week later with specific technical questions. He wanted to understand the flue connections, the damper controls, and the chimney stack design. Henrik showed him everything, explaining the engineering decisions and the lessons learned during construction. Schmidt measured dimensions, sketched details in his own notebook, and asked about material costs. He was planning to build a similar system for his own cabin before the next winter. On January 23, 1844, the coldest day of the winter, Henrik hosted 5 neighboring families in his cabin for a gathering that became an unintentional demonstration of his heating system's capabilities. The outdoor temperature had dropped to 26 degrees below zero. Most settlers were confined to their homes, huddling near their fireplaces and venturing outside only when absolutely necessary. Henrik had invited the neighbors weeks earlier, and despite the brutal cold, all 5 families made the journey. The gathering began at midday. As families arrived, stamping snow from their boots and unwrapping layers of clothing, they immediately noticed the cabin's warmth. Children who had been bundled in heavy coats removed them within minutes. Adults commented on the comfortable temperature. Henrik had all 3 fireplaces burning steadily, maintained throughout the morning to ensure the cabin was thoroughly warm before guests arrived. Thomas McCarty arrived first with his wife and 3 children. He walked directly to the northeast corner, the location he remembered as freezing during his previous visit 2 winters earlier. He placed his hand against the log wall. It was warm. He checked the southeast corner near the door, also warm. He turned to Henrik and said simply that he had never felt a cabin so evenly heated. His wife asked Karin detailed questions about managing 3 fires simultaneously and whether the extra work was worthwhile. Karin confirmed that the system required more attention, but made winter living dramatically more comfortable. Johann Schmidt arrived with his family and immediately began examining the technical details. He studied the damper controls, asking Henrik to demonstrate how adjustments affected each fire. Henrik showed him how partially closing one damper reduced that fire's intensity, while the others continued burning normally. Schmidt took notes and measured the dimensions of the angled flue channels. He was convinced enough to begin planning a similar system for his own cabin. Lars Olsen, who had called the design madness the previous spring, arrived last. He was visibly uncomfortable, admitting he had been wrong, but the evidence was undeniable. His own cabin had been barely tolerable that morning, despite burning wood aggressively. His children had complained about the cold corners. His wife had asked why they couldn't have a cabin like Henrik's. Olsen examined the 3 fireplaces carefully and asked about construction costs and timeline. Henrik provided honest answers. The system had cost $17 in materials and required 8 weeks of full-time labor, but the results justified the investment completely. The gathering lasted 4 hours. Children played throughout the cabin, running from corner to corner without needing to stay near heat sources. Adults sat comfortably wherever they chose, not confined to a small warm zone near a single fireplace. Conversation focused primarily on Henrik's heating system, with multiple families asking for plans and advice on building similar systems. By the time guests departed in late afternoon, Henrik had agreed to help 3 families design and build their own 3 fireplace systems before the next winter. The social proof was complete. What had been dismissed as folly 9 months earlier was now recognized as genuine innovation. Henrik had demonstrated that tradition could be improved through careful observation, sound engineering, and willingness to attempt something unprecedented. The coldest day of winter had become the moment when his heating system earned full acceptance from the settlement community. Word of Henrik's successful heating system spread beyond his immediate settlement through the spring and summer of 1844. Travelers passing through the area heard stories about a Norwegian settler who had built a cabin with 3 fireplaces and 1 chimney that stayed warm in every corner. Some dismissed these stories as exaggeration, but others were intrigued enough to investigate personally. By autumn, Henrik had consulted on heating system designs for families in 4 different settlements within 50 miles of his own claim. The first external request came in April from a settler named William Crawford who lived 30 miles northwest. Crawford had heard about Henrik's system from a traveling merchant and sent a written message requesting information. Henrik responded with detailed sketches and a letter explaining the principles behind the design. Crawford wrote back with specific questions about his cabin's dimensions and layout. Through a series of letters exchanged over 2 months, Henrik helped Crawford adapt the 3 fireplace concept to a cabin that was larger than Henrik's and had different proportions. Johann Schmidt completed the first replica system in his own cabin during the summer of 1844. He followed Henrik's design closely, but made modifications based on his carpentry experience. Schmidt's cabin was smaller, so he used only 2 fireplaces, rather than 3, positioning them in opposite corners and connecting both to a central chimney stack. The construction took him 6 weeks working alone. When tested during the autumn, his system worked excellently, confirming that the principles Henrik had discovered could be adapted to different structures. Thomas McCarty began building his 3 fireplace system in July. Unlike Schmidt, McCarty had limited masonry experience and needed Henrik's direct assistance. Henrik spent a week helping McCarty plan the layout, build the foundation, and start the chimney stack. McCarty completed the remaining work over 8 weeks, checking frequently with Henrik when he encountered problems. His system was operational by late September and performed well during the winter of 1844 to 1845. The spread of the technology followed predictable patterns. Early adopters were settlers who had experienced serious cold problems in their cabins and recognized that standard solutions were inadequate. They were willing to invest significant time and money to improve their living conditions. Later adopters were often newer settlers, building first cabins who incorporated the 3 fireplace design from the beginning, rather than retrofitting existing structures. Building a 3 fireplace system during initial construction was simpler than demolishing an existing fireplace and rebuilding as Henrik had done. By 1846, at least 12 cabins in the Minnesota Territory had been built or modified using variations of Henrik's design. The systems were not identical. Some used 3 fireplaces like Henrik's original. Others used 2 or 4 depending on cabin size and layout. Some incorporated the angled flue channels. Others positioned fireplaces so all could connect directly to a central chimney without angled runs. But all shared the core concept of multiple small fires connected to a single chimney stack, creating distributed heat sources that warmed spaces uniformly. The heating system acquired a name through informal usage. Settlers referred to it as Larson heating or the Larson method, acknowledging Henrik as the originator. Some called it triple fire heating or distributed fireplace design. Regardless of terminology, the concept was recognized as a significant improvement over traditional single fireplace construction for cold climate cabins. The 1850s brought significant changes to the Minnesota Territory. The fur trade that had initially drawn settlers westward was largely finished, replaced by agriculture and timber harvesting. The population increased dramatically as more families claimed land under federal homestead policies. Towns developed where previously only scattered settlements existed. Building practices evolved rapidly as professional craftsmen arrived and construction became more standardized. Henrik's heating system became incorporated into this evolution. By 1852, builders in the St. Paul area were offering 3 fireplace systems as an option for new home construction. The design had been refined through multiple iterations. Builders developed standardized dimensions for firebox sizes, flue channels, and chimney stacks. They created templates and construction guides that made the systems easier to build consistently. What Henrik had developed through experimentation and individual problem-solving had become a recognized building technique with established methods. The impact on winter habitability was measurable in ways beyond just comfort. Families living in cabins with distributed heating systems reported fewer respiratory illnesses during winter months. Children sleeping in well-heated corners rather than freezing zones showed lower rates of pneumonia and other cold-related conditions. The local doctor in Henrik's settlement documented this pattern in records he kept from 1845 through 1855, noting that families with Larson heating systems requested medical visits approximately 40% less frequently during winter than families with traditional single-fireplace cabins. The phrase, "built like a Larson cabin," entered local usage by the mid-1850s. It signified a structure designed with careful attention to heating and comfort, rather than just basic shelter. Real estate advertisements in territorial newspapers mentioned Larson heating as a desirable feature. Cabins equipped with the system commanded higher sale prices than comparable structures with standard fireplaces. Henrik's innovation had become economically valuable as well as practically beneficial. Henrik Larson died on March 14, 1869, at age 60. He had lived 28 years past the winter when he first conceived his 3-fireplace system. He never sought recognition or profit from his innovation. He helped neighbors build their own systems freely and shared his designs with anyone who asked. He spent his later years farming his land, raising his family, and participating quietly in the growing community around him. By the time of Henrik's death, his heating system was already becoming obsolete. Cast iron stoves manufactured in eastern factories had become widely available and affordable during the 1850s and 1860s. These stoves were far more efficient than any fireplace system, easier to install, and required no complex masonry work. They could be positioned anywhere in a cabin and vented through simple sheet metal chimneys. Within a decade of Henrik's death, most new cabins were built with stoves rather than fireplaces. The 3 fireplace systems that existed continued functioning for years, but as cabins aged and were replaced, the technique faded from use. By 1890, few builders remembered how to construct distributed fireplace systems. The knowledge became historical rather than practical. Henrik's name was forgotten except in a few family histories and local records that mentioned him as an early settler. Modern architectural historians rediscovered Henrik's innovation in the 1970s while surveying remaining 19th-century structures in Minnesota. Several abandoned cabins with unusual triple chimney stacks were documented and studied. Researchers traced the design back to Henrik through land records and settlement documents. They recognized his system as a sophisticated engineering solution to heating problems that plagued frontier dwellings. Today, the ruins of Henrik's original cabin still stand on land that has been preserved as historical property. The triple chimney stack remains partially intact, weathered but recognizable. It serves as a physical reminder that innovation often comes from necessity and that ordinary people solving immediate problems sometimes create solutions with lasting significance. Henrik Larsen built something unprecedented because his daughter was cold, and in doing so, he changed how settlers survived winter on the American frontier.